Know what you grow. Sponsored by Ag Exchange Group, provider of CXN 360. Be in control of your market. The CXN 360 online marketplace puts you in control with a transparent and efficient marketplace that gives you real-time access to buyers.
Thanks everyone for attending today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with the crop right now, what we're seeing, and kind of things that I've noticed are coming up as an issue that may impact grain as we get closer to harvest and during harvest that may be important to consider to help maintain the quality and maintain the value of that crop. So for those of you who don't know me, again, I work with the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. I'm their Agronomy Research Extension Specialist. So my role is to help deliver the research that is funded through the commissions back to producers and back to the industry. So that way we're helping drive some of that new technology and new agronomic management practices right into the industry. So I did my schooling at the University of Guelph, where I did my undergrad and my master's in plant physiology, and then worked in Ontario as an agronomist with Cargill for a few years in the Bradford Marsh area, working with carrots, onions, potatoes, and also with corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. So I had a variety of different crops there. And then in 2015, I moved to Western Canada and worked with Cargill, and then a foliar kind of specialty fertilizer company, and then moved on and worked with, and now I'm with the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission. So kind of have a breadth of history there, different parts of Canada. But yeah, so today I'm going to cover current conditions, some things to think about in terms of Fusarium Head Blight, glyphosate timing, because that's looking like it may be a little bit of a challenge or concern this year. Falling number, this may have been a problem for some producers in the past couple of years, more notably likely last year, and how to manage that and how to look at storage, and then some other considerations that would be important to think about as we move forward. So current conditions, this is a current map of accumulated precipitation over the past 60 days. And for those of you in Alberta, you can really maybe take note of how much moisture has come down in northwestern part of that province. Saskatchewan is kind of sitting in a medium state in there, and then it looks like Manitoba is a little bit drier. So you can see they've got that panel up there. So it'll be interesting to see from all of the people that are part of this, what you're seeing for moisture. So in Alberta, we've seen excessive amounts of rain coming down. I mean, soil is thoroughly saturated. So that was a picture I took just west of Red Deer not too long ago. Not an atypical picture. You're seeing a lot of yellowing coming in, and this is creating variable crops. So this is going to create a challenge when it comes to harvest, when it comes to timing, and when it comes to glyphosate applications. And I imagine in those drier parts of maybe Manitoba, we will see issues with variable staging there as well, some late tillers. So again, a mixed bag, as it always is across the prairies, but this is kind of what we're seeing right now. And there's topsoil moisture conditions for Saskatchewan. So we have some dry spots, but in general, we're looking pretty good. So yeah, it looks like 38% are wet, 38%, yeah, really a mixed bag coming up there from those poles. So perfect. So just continuing on with conditions in Alberta, and I know in parts of Saskatchewan, we saw some late seeded crop. We didn't really have a nice spring to get get that crop in. So we already have some late maturing crop from the producers that I've chatted with. There's some concern heading into the latter part of the season that maturity is going to be a little bit later than we want it to, which means we're going to have some potential issues heading into that harvest timing. I've heard issues coming up of cabbage seed pod weevil, and then some wheat midge and some wheat stem sawfly. And these are all things that can reduce the quality of your crop. So they're things to be out there scouting for. And then again, with those high moisture conditions, we're seeing foliar disease pop up. And this can take away from your photosynthetic area, which can reduce the size of your grain and the quality in some aspects. So you can see some images that I've pulled there. We're seeing some rust in the southern part of the province that needs to continue to be watched for, because rust can move rather quickly and the threshold is rather low. There's some barley with some scald there as well. This is not an uncommon sight in the western part of Alberta. I'm not sure what we're looking like into Saskatchewan, but definitely something that can increase risk in your crop. And then wheat midge. So that one photo that you can see there, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but a wheat midge showing up there on the heads. And this is something that can reduce the quality of your grain. So getting out there and scouting is going to be important. And then this photo wasn't taken this year. This is last year from wheat standing after a snowfall. So with that late maturing crop, it's a concern. And one thing with this added moisture, and you can see these are three maps of Fusarium risk in the prairies. The one on the left is Alberta, the one in the center is Saskatchewan, and then the one on the right is Manitoba. And you can see, as it relates to that initial moisture map over the 60 days, the amount of moisture that's come down, it kind of follows that trend of how much moisture we're seeing and where the risk is. So behind, but we should be fine. So that's good to hear. Hopefully we have a decent fall that stays open, and we continue to be in that, we should be fine kind of range. But you can see that Fusarium risk is kind of going from that high moisture area into Saskatchewan, where we have a high risk there, and then into Manitoba, where the risk is a little bit lower because we're seeing a little bit less moisture in that region. So it's one thing to be monitoring, making sure that you know whether you're at risk based on environmental conditions. So Fusarium Head Blight management. Fusarium Head Blight is really a disease, and I'm sure we've all heard this before, that impacts you on three accounts. It's going to impact yield with those Fusarium damaged kernels. It's also going to increase or decrease your quality. So it's going to bring down your grade and lower the amount of money you're going to get for your grain. And then it's going to impact potentially your marketability. So that's dawn and feedability is going to potentially decrease the ability for you to sell that crop. So it really hits on three different accounts. So it's important to be keeping a close eye on this. I know in Alberta, we've seen an increase in locations where we're seeing Fusarium risk, where we're seeing it in seed that's being tested. So the increased risk across the province is certainly something that's being monitored. So how do we mitigate this at this point? Obviously, there's tactics that you can enlist as you're planning for each season, but now that we're in the season, how do we continue to mitigate the potential risk of Fusarium Head Blight? And the one thing that you can do that I've shown the maps for is that risk map monitoring. So each province has a Fusarium Head Blight risk map that you can find by searching on Google or searching through the government sites. And that will give you a up-to-date risk map of what the risk of Fusarium Head Blight is in your area. And that's based off of moisture, it's based off of humidity, and it's based off of temperature. And these come together to create kind of a formula to say, under these conditions, we're seeing a higher risk. But it's important to get out there and actually field check these risk maps. You're walking through at midday. Are you still wet and you're on your pants as you're walking through that crop? If you're seeing a high risk on the map, but you walk out there in the morning and everything's bone dry, I would kind of be hesitant to say that it's as exactly representative of that field. So it's important to not just look at the map, but also walk through your crop and seeing if you're seeing high humidity conditions in that crop as well. You want to make sure that you're under if you are spraying a fungicide because you are at high risk, you're doing it at ideal timing, which in a later slide I'll kind of talk about what ideal timing looks like, specifically in wheat and a little bit in barley. And then if you are spraying, or even if you didn't end up spraying, going through 1 to 2 weeks in that 2 week range after anthesis to see if you're seeing any shriveled kernels or any Fusarium head blight spores, that discoloration showing up. And this can kind of give you a pre-indication of whether you're at risk of being downgraded or having Fusarium damaged kernels in your crop, and help you kind of plan to say, okay, we're likely going to have to test this seed or test this grain to see what the quality is like moving forward, and maybe plan to manage that grain as it's coming off the field a little bit differently in terms of storage. So yeah, again, a little bit of a mixed bag of whether there's been spraying going on or not. Yeah. Harvest management can be kind of depending on your location and depending on how much inoculum is in your field. It can be a decision of whether you want to collect those Fusarium damaged kernels in your chaff collector, or whether you want to spread those back on the field by increasing your fan speed. And really, this is a discussion of whether you want to be reintroducing Fusarium inoculum back into your field. So Fusarium infected kernels are some of the most highly infected parts of the plant. So if you're in an area that has very low inoculum, or you haven't seen Fusarium historically, and then all of a sudden this year you're seeing Fusarium damaged kernels, to broadcast those Fusarium damaged kernels back onto your field is further inoculating your crop or your field. So you may want to instead collect those kernels by not increasing your fan speed, and then cleaning them out using a grain cleaner of some nature after. And the other thing you can do is slow down if you are planning on blowing those Fusarium damaged kernels at the back. This will help make sure that you're getting proper airflow through and it's cleaning it properly. The other thing you can think of is, or if it's possible for you, is a little bit earlier harvest. So if you are at 19% moisture or below, that dawn accumulation in your kernels is going to slow down. So if you're above that, and you're in that 19% range and you can take it off, it would be a good option to take it off if that's a possibility for you. For storage, you want to have the potential to store infected grain separately. This can help you manage different lots of grain, and then avoid putting piles of potentially infected grain on the ground. That moisture from the soil is going to get into the kernels and further increase the amount of dawn in your grain. So avoiding putting that potentially infected grain on the ground. And then the last thing you want to do is get your grain tested. Send it to an accredited lab to get it tested for Fusarium as a plate test, as a DNA test, to see what levels you're at, to see how you can A, manage that crop where you're going to sell it, and then B, whether you're going to utilize it for next year. And if you are going to utilize it, how to best manage it, whether you're using a seed treatment or potentially not using it at all. So in terms of timing, wheat timing is you're really looking for that beginning of anthesis. So I've got 3 images here, day -7, day -4, and day 0. Day 0 is when you really want to be working to apply that fungicide, that head timing fungicide for wheat. And it is about a week from that boot stage where you're just seeing the awns poking up, to that early application timing of anthesis. And then with barley, because anthesis occurs while it's still in the boot, you're really looking for that 100% head emergence timing. At that time, you're looking to protect all of the heads that have come out, because that's really your goal with the Fusarium Head Blight timing fungicide application, is to protect as much of the head as possible. With wheat, you're looking to protect those anthers. It's kind of indicated that as those anthers are out, you're at an increased risk. But that doesn't mean that that's the only time that wheat is at risk of infection. Infection can occur prior to anthesis and actually after, all the way into soft dough. But you really want to be targeting that early anthesis timing, because that seems to have the greatest impact on quality mitigation and yield. So aiming for those times is going to be ideal. So next is glyphosate timing. And as I talked a little bit earlier, we had some late seeded crop and we're having some variable crop. So it's going to be important for us to look at the crop and make sure we're applying our pre-harvest glyphosate at the proper timing. And the reason this is important is a lot of the majority of Canada's grain actually gets shipped internationally. So over 90% of its canola, 80% of its wheat, and 80% of its pulses go internationally. So we're not just growing for Canadian standards, we're growing for international standards and all the different markets that we sell to. And those markets, those trade markets are shifting. We are seeing an increase in protectionism of different countries wanting to make sure that they're protecting their own farmers before bringing in crops from different countries. So they're using MRLs to kind of protect their own crop production. There's also increased amount of testing that's occurring, and then the increased accuracy down to parts per billion of that testing. So when we get into these scenarios, it's important for us as an export industry to make sure that we are aligned with those MRLs, so we can continue to maintain those markets in the future. So will you be using, this poll came up, will you be using glyphosate as part of your pre-harvest program this season? 60% said yes. And that's kind of typical for what I would see. About 60% and 40% maybe not. And we always hope for those open falls, but as a weed control system, glyphosate as a pre-harvest is a great tool to utilize. So in terms of timing, one thing that I will point everyone to is keeping it clean. You can see on the top right there, keepingitclean.ca. This is a Cereals Canada website that provides a plethora of information, not just on glyphosate application timing, but on MRL considerations in general when producing a crop in Western Canada and in Canada in general. So I highly recommend you take a look at this website. It's filled with resources to make sure that any kind of insecticide, fungicide, herbicide that's being used on a crop is being used properly. There's tools to help manage, if I'm spraying this crop at this time, am I going to make it in time for harvest, or those MRLs or those pre-harvest intervals, whether I'm going to meet those or not. So a great website to check out. So I've pulled 3 different images from this Keeping It Clean website here. There is more information on other crops that use glyphosate as a pre-harvest, but with canola, you're looking for that 30% moisture, grain moisture, which the top on the main stem, those top seeds are green and they're firm to roll. They're not mushing at all. The ones more in the center third are mostly brown with some speckling. And then at the bottom, you're looking for completely brown to black seeds. And that's when you're in that 30% moisture range. And you really want your least advanced part of the field to be at that stage. And this is true of all of these examples here. So with wheat, you're looking at 30% moisture. Again, the same as canola. However, the way to determine that 30% moisture is a little bit different. You're going to go in and you're going to hand thresh those heads, again, in the least mature part of the field. And you're going to do the thumbnail test where you grab a kernel and you push your thumbnail into that kernel, and you want to be able to push your thumbnail into the kernel. And you can see in that image there, actually, those are my hands pushing that thumbnail imprint in. And that's a perfect image of a 30% moisture where you can see the indent of my fingernail has stayed. It's not pushing back out, but it's not impossible for me to push my nail in there. If I can't push my nail in there, it's way past 30%. It's more like in the 20% or lower range. So that's the visual you're kind of looking for wheat. And then with peas, you're looking for 80% of those pods to be yellow or golden brown. And then the seeds in the bottom pods are detached. And if you rattle those pods, or if you shake those pods, they'll rattle. So again, there's a lot more information on keepingitclean.ca. I'd love to talk about all of the different crops and how to time them, but keepingitclean.ca does a good job of covering all those. So I highly recommend to take a look and make sure your application timing is where you want it to be. So moving on to falling number, this was one thing that was a significant conversation point last year. There was a lot of confusion as to why falling number is now an issue and it wasn't before, and what's causing it, and how do I best manage it. So that poll popped up there. Is falling number a concern for you this season? Falling number is really a measurement of the grain starch breakdown into sugar. So as that grain is filling, it's building starches in that kernel, and then under certain weather conditions, that kernel will actually start to turn that starch into sugars. And this is not something that we like to see when it comes to end-use quality, milling, baking. So it decreases the quality of that end-use product, the bread. So a lower falling number means more starch breakdown. So if you get results back of your falling number, typically we want to be in the 400 range is nice, 450 is wonderful. And if you get below that 300, you're starting to get into the risk zone. A lower falling number will impact the end-use product quality. You get holes in the bread. It doesn't rise as well. It's very dry and crumbly, and actually for the bakers, it requires more water for them to actually produce a loaf of bread, so their efficiency goes down. It is an internationally used standard, so when grain buyers or when buyers are purchasing grain for bread making internationally, they are asking for certain falling numbers. So it's something that's being asked for internationally, but it's not currently part of the Canadian Grain Commission grading system. And this can create marketing challenges for producers and companies selling it internationally. So it's something that's still being discussed quite heavily of how do we properly integrate it. And it's primarily caused by environmental factors during harvest season. It's something that, when Mother Nature brings us an early September snowfall, that is really what's triggering this. So it's a question of how do we put ourselves in a lower risk scenario to mitigate the potential impacts of falling number. We'll never be able to completely eliminate it as a risk, but we'll be able to utilize varieties that may be at lower risk, or use management practices that will help mitigate putting us in a scenario where falling number risk is higher. So some of the tools at this point, there are tools that you can use early on in the season, or when you're planning on how to mitigate falling number decrease, and that's by choosing shorter season varieties. You're going to take a yield hit, but if you're seeing falling number impacts each year, it may be something you want to utilize. Choosing varieties that are more sprouting resistant. Falling number is kind of a factor that leads into sprouting. As those starches break down into sugars, those sugars are then used for sprouting. So it's part of the same system. So picking varieties that have stronger resistance to sprouting, you're picking also stronger resistance to falling number decrease. So again, mixed bag there of whether it's a concern. And I think that shows kind of who's dealing with high moisture or cold rain or snow at the end of the season during harvest. So how do we manage crop for potentially low falling numbers? At this point, if you're in your harvest scenario and you're pulling off a bunch of your wheat and it looks great, it's coming off great, and then you're halfway through your wheat and you get hit with a cold, wet snow, and you're not able to get at that until a week or so later, maybe even longer than that. If you can, segregating those two crops is going to be important. It's likely that falling number has been impacted by that snow. So if you can keep that later harvested crop in a different bin and manage it differently, it's going to put you in a stronger situation when you go to market that grain. The next step would be making sure that you're testing from multiple sources, sending to independent accreditable labs, taking it to different elevators, and using the CGC harvest sample program. And the reason I say this is because results from falling number tests can be variable. So the table there that I've shown at the bottom is actual numbers from a producer that sent me his falling number tests, and 3 to 4 different tests from different locations from the same bins, and the variance he saw in results. So you can see their bin 18 had a range of up to 50. And when elevators have a hard stop number, if you're below 300 or 250 falling number, you're getting a loss of value of your grain. That can be a big loss. So to see that there's that much variance, it's important to get multiple tests done to know where you stand with that grain, to better be able to manage and market it. And because you have segregated it and because you have tested all of that, you're going to be able to leverage your higher falling number grain to potentially move your lower falling number grain. So keeping those piles separate and then testing them appropriately, and then having those discussions with your elevators on how you can move that grain, so they can take your lower falling number and your higher falling number stuff. And this is going to require you to make sure that you're sampling well, making sure that you're taking representative samples. Refer to the CGC website. They have a great information sheet on how to make sure that you're properly sampling your grain. This is going to help make sure that you're not taking it from poor areas or just from better areas, and then you end up with surprises later in the season when you go to market that grain. Store only dry grain. If that grain goes into the bin higher than 14.5, you're going to end up having a continued breakdown of those starches into sugars. So if you can, wait till it's fully dry before taking it off and putting it in the bin, or run it through a dryer. And this is going to stop that grain from having a lower and lower falling number until you take it out of that bin. And then do not blend. The blending is very different with falling number than it is for something like protein, where you mix 2 different proteins together and you get somewhere in the middle. Falling number does not work that way. There's one example scenario here, and this is just an example of a ratio. Your ratios are going to be different depending on what your actual falling numbers are. But if you tried to mix a 450 falling number and a 100 falling number, the ratio would be around a 9-to-1 mixing to get a falling number of 350. If your target falling number is different, your ratio is going to be different. And if your initial falling numbers are different, you're going to end up with a different ratio. So it's a high risk maneuver to try and blend. So that's why it's best to segregate your crop, test it in multiple sites so you know what you're working with, and then have that discussion with your elevator on how you can move both of those high and low falling number lots. And that's going to put you in the best position to try and manage lower falling number grain. Some other considerations as we're moving through this season is as we continue to get moisture, especially in the western part of the prairies, is leaf disease issues are going to continue to rise. So don't forget to continue to go out there and check to see whether your leaf diseases are increasing. As your grain is filling, those leaves are providing energy to help fill that grain. So even after anthesis, those leaves are important to help increase yield, to help get those big, heavy kernels. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining those as long as you can. Wheat midge, the scouting time is very much upon us. The highest risk time is right at emergence up until flowering. After flowering, the risk goes down quite significantly. So you want to be out there scouting just before and right at head emergence to see whether you're getting wheat midge, and then control if necessary. Wheat stem sawfly, we saw an increase last year. And I have a feeling we'll be seeing an increase this year. The early monitoring time is a little bit past us. It was late June, early July to go out and sweep and see if you're finding. And then because we're past that point now in late July, if you think you're at risk of wheat stem sawfly, you're going to go cut a few stems, slice them down the middle open, and see if you can't find any larvae in those stems. If you're finding larvae, then you know that you're at risk of lodging, and you can monitor those as you head into harvest, and then make the decision of whether you can early harvest or swath those problem areas before they lodge on their own and have a decreased quality. So those are the major issues I've seen this year in terms of quality potential impacts as we head into harvest.